corporations, many corporations here in the United States, and then leave some time for conversation, question, and answering. So let me see if I can share. My share button was cut off. I just tested it was working. If someone can. Maybe the host can give me the power to share again. Share screen.
Amar, can you help Professor Hopkins, please?
Yeah, we're there. Thank you.
Yes, sir. I've made you the presenter.
Yeah, we're here. Good stuff. Let's see, just a minute. Okay. Right, so let me try to make this bigger. There we go. Good, so that's just who I am. You've heard that introduction. So, so the purpose of our conversation today is to how do we write an environment, social, and governance annual report for any company, which includes obviously the leadership role of the board of directors. And one of the big payoffs is that these annual ESG reports can actually support various programs at the United Nations. One of the most important ones today is the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the annual report not only helps the company, but it also links it to a larger global momentum as well. And so, we can give examples of how different parts of a company's company's annual ESG report can relate to different SDGs, that is the United Nations Social Development Goals. And we just gave here the example of how issues around good health and well-being are linked to SDG 3 and carbon emissions, SDG 7, sustainable cities and communities, SDG 11, and then climate action, SDG 13. The main point is to just give an example of how when we do the annual report, ESG report for a company, they can be actually mapped to not necessarily all 17 United Nations goals, but at least quite a many. And so, what does the ESG annual report do, particularly for the corporation? Well, one of the big things is it helps the reputation, which of course increases the brand trust among various stakeholders. It obviously avoids bad regulations. To put it more positively, it helps fall within the governmental regulations, and then it increases demand, particularly from customers, which, as we know, will increase both the bottom line and the top line revenue as well as profit. So brand, reputation, governmental regulations, and the bottom line. As we know, there are annual financial reports that contain the balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement. The annual ESG report is the non-financial annual report. And what it does is it looks at ESG practices, environmental, social, and governance practices of the corporation, and translate those practices into money earned and money lost. So a positive ESG annual report obviously will attract more investors and more customers, as we mentioned earlier. So both the financial reports and the ESG annual reports help the company to lower risk and increase profit. We can talk about more about that later. But the main takeaway from this is that the ESG report, the annual ESG report, is a complement to the annual financial report. It is the non-financials translated into dollars, or rupees, if you will. This slide here is to try to get clear on what ESG is not. ESG is not philanthropy. That is, a corporation's a family foundation like the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation. They give money to people, and they don't expect anything in return in terms of money, except for an annual report back. Same thing, ESG is not volunteer work, which corporations give employees time off. Like now it's Christmas season in the United States, so the whole country is pretty much shut down as far as a lot of the workers are doing. And a lot of people are preparing a lot of Christmas baskets for poor people. That's volunteer work. Social responsible investing. Historically, it's called do no harm. It's basically don't invest in bad companies or products. Both the United Nations and the World Council of Churches in Geneva back in the early mid 60s were leaders in this. And then there's impact investing. Impact investing is when a company specifically has a mission to impact society, for example, to clean up trash in the ocean or something to that effect. So all these things are important: philanthropy, volunteer work, socially responsible investing, and impact investing, but they're not quite ESG. So what is ESG? ESG focuses on the triple bottom line: profit, people, and the environment. And it covers all parts of a company's relationship, from gathering of raw materials for a product to the sale of that product to a customer, and everything in between. So it's an internal look at how to make sure that all parts of the company, both its process, its structure, its leadership, its production, its services, in relation to customers, are ESG, practicing ESG at a high level. Basically, in each stage of the production that a corporation engages in, the question is how can we improve our ESG practices at each stage, all the way down, all the way up. So, basically what are we saying? We're saying, in other words, we're applying the ESG practices to all company relationships, obviously supply chain, even engineering. How are they dealing with ESG practices? Marketing, sales, employees, with the board of directors, which is important for us this morning, R&D, manufacturing, just all distribution channels, customers, executive team, and how the company relates to local communities. That's what ESG does as a comprehensive approach. So we wanted to talk about how to write an ESG report, and basically wanted to use a template of a structure. Obviously, corporations tinker with it here and there, but these are the basic parts of it. And hopefully this will help raise some questions and some comments after I finish with the slide, with the PowerPoint here. One of the most important things we see in these annual ESG reports, whether it's Tesla or Exxon, they're all online, they all have them in the US, is that they talk about the structure. This is that the leadership, and what makes up the leadership that's guiding the ESG annual report. Usually, not usually all, they have some board of directors ESG committee. They call it different things, but it's ESG. And oftentimes they have an executive leadership ESG, and then they'll have an ESG working committee. And for certain companies, this includes all kinds of chairs: ESG chair, the global sustainment chair, DE, all of this, social impact, legal compliance, right? All the members of the ESG working committee, led by the company's executive committee, overseen by the board of directors. And then the final structure is the independent audit committee, which is the one that signs off before the annual ESG report is actually becomes public and is given to government regulators. There's a section on purpose and mission, which makes sense, right? We want to talk about how ESG is not just an extraneous subdivision of the company, but actually ESG is linked to the existence, the doing, and the goal, purpose, and mission. And I just gave some examples. Uber's exists to reimagine the world, reimagine the way the world moves for the better. What does the company do? Uber says is make real life easier to navigate for everyone. And then what is the company's goal? Tesla says to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. So already Uber is not just to pick up people, but they have a whole purpose and a mission. And Tesla is not just to make these fancy, expensive cars, but its actual goal is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. So in this section on purpose and mission, ESG is embedded in the very mission and purpose of the company. And then there's a section on culture and values of the corporation. What does the corporate company stand for? What kind of environment does the company have? What are the culture and values that guide how the company makes decisions? And one of the examples I always use when I either in educational institutions or corporate sector is to say, if I were to visit this company and I talk to the leadership, the C-suite, and then I also talk to the woman who's at the receptionist desk when you walk into corporate headquarters with the executive team and the receptionist, would he or she to give me the same understanding of culture and values? That's a very powerful sort of common sense way to see if the words on the website around culture and values actually are embedded from the first person you see to the major decision makers in the C-suite, as well as the board. Then there's a section on the CEO statement. This is very important in these annual ESG reports because again, we want the top person to write a statement describing how the company relates to ESG governance practices. It just indicates that the highest officer in the company takes ESG very seriously. And so the CEO talks about how the company works and how ESG relates to how the company works and how ESG is important for how the leadership thinks. And this will all be part of the CEO statement. And then there's a section on the company's products and services. It makes sense, right? So the ESG has just been elaborated by the CEO about the corporation. Well, concretely, what do you do? And then, you talk about the products and services of the company and describe what these products and services, what type of contribution they make to society. And this last one, a brief statement showing how ESG practices improve the company's revenue in the last 12 months. A lot of annual reports will have this in here just to give it sort of a tease at the beginning of the report that ESG practices, in fact, they touch the bottom line. That is, they improve the bottom line in the last 12 months. So it's usually a dollar figure can go there or a percentage improvement there. So the question is, well, how does ESG practices relate to a specific company, right? And here, the main thing here is to take from the list of all the practices under E, under S, and the G, only take those practices that pertain to the particular company, right? So if there's a company that relies a lot on, water or produces a lot of pollution, then obviously pollution has to be one of the ESG practices in the annual report. So too, if there's a positive, there's good leadership, then improving governance, G is not a priority, but it can be indicated. That is, we're going to spend more money on the challenges, less so on the good aspects of it. Because part of the ESG report is to both give risk assessment of the company as well as opportunities for growth, investment, revenue. So again, that's the question of, you're not going to use all of the. So here are all these practices, right? Carbon footprint under the E, the environment, biodiversity, toxic, raw material sourcing. You're not going to use all of those. Just use those, just use one or two that are important for your company. Similarly, we can go down the list for social practices, health and safety, injury, labor standards, human rights, product safety, chemical safety, supply chain, social factors. So all of these are about 12 or so. No company will use all 12. They may use 2, maybe 3. Most I've seen is about 3, maybe 4. And similar with the G, governance, from tax transparency, risk management, the quality of the board, both independent board, non-independent board members, ownership, remuneration payment. All of these are under governance, and of course, transparency, anti-corruption. But I never have seen a report or dealt with a company that would use all of these under G, just those that are relevant for your own company, and each company differs. Then there's a section on the decision-making process, and this decision-making process of the board. This is very important for transparency, and also for branding, and also for reputation, and also, having customers buy in addition to regulators, but particularly the public and the customers. That is, what was the actual process, a section on that? How the board of directors, ESG committee, which is the leadership, ultimate leadership, initiated, planned, and participate, led, and completed the ESG report. and just go over the step-by-step process. We can talk more about that. And of course, it's very important to talk about how the company got its ESG ratings. So the decision-making process from beginning to end, and the end being the ESG rating. This is a very important section for the public. We don't necessarily have to go on all of this, but basically the decision-making process of the board has three parts. There's a research part, there's a data part, and there's a scoring and revenue part. So for the sake of time, I may not go into all of that, but well, just briefly, we won't do all of it. So there are three parts to the decision-making process of the board. There's research, data, scoring, and revenue. And under the research, the basic question is, who did the Board of ESG Oversight Committee talk with, right? Which reports did they do? Did they read? Where did they visit? So it's laying out the data collecting part, the actual research, and saying, if they talk to the receptionist in the front part of the door, or they talk to a supply chain person in, Amazon, Brazil, who the research, lay out the decision-making process as far as research, what kind of meetings that they hold with different stakeholders. And that's just, there's aspects of research we don't have to go into, and the second part of decision-making, first part, of course, is research. Second part of decision-making of the board is data. So after you've got all the research, you've got to report the data. And again, here you want to find out so give us the data that shows how you chose the specific ESG practices. You're not going to choose all 12 under E, S, and G. So show the data on how you went about getting consensus on which are the important ESG practices. And there's a whole process with this. So you can do this through, show that you did, interviews with employees. You send out questionnaires to people. You made trips, those types of things, right? So that's the concrete data that you have. And then when you do your research and you find out things like carbon emissions either went up or went down, hopefully it went down, you can actually give percentage of reduction. That's a important data point. Same example, if your relations with your employees is a top ESG factor, you can show how your employees have improved year on year. You can use actually percentages of the numbers, so you're presenting the real data here. So again, just giving other examples of data. And then the third part of the decision-making process, research, data, scoring, and revenue. Now, a lot of the scoring is not necessarily arbitrary, but there's no consensus. So different international rating boards have their different numbers. 200 to 100, 1 to 5, 1 to 10. So the main thing is to choose your rating system. So if say you got data, you have all the research, you've got the data, and now how are you going to rate this data? So you could say I use 1 to 5 for each of the three categories. So rate each of the factors 1 to 5 under environment, under social, and the governance. And to a degree, you've got to make a judgment about the scores. I give the example, if your carbon emission was cut by 100%, you could actually assign a number 1. So on my scale, number 1 is good, and 5 is the lowest, it's the laggards. So if your carbon emission doubled year on year, you obviously give a number 5 for very poor performance. Again, there's a certain degree of judgment that has to be made on the ranges, 1, 1.5, 2.3, 4. I mean, obviously when a lot of the rating agencies get there, they're making a decision. The main thing here is to be consistent and provide the data that gave you these numbers and consistency. As we say, give a rationale for each of the numbers about the ESG practices. And we talked about 30% or not 90%. There's just an example of giving the rationale for the data. Now, you can also, as I mentioned, you can put a dollar figure in the scoring section. For example, there's a company that, say, a year earlier, they were using a lot of plastics, and they were putting the plastics in dump fills, landfills. And then they instituted a program where they did recycling. And so that recycling actually reduced the impact on the dumps so anyway, you could show how with the last 12 months, you cut back on pollution and plastics to a certain degree. Okay, let's see. All right, somebody has given me a pencil here. Okay. Again, so what's important, the big picture on the decision-making process, that section of the of the annual report, the point is to show all the meetings, all the phone calls, all the visits, all the reports that were read, for each of the top ESG practices. So you want to just give all the transparent data and process there. Also, it's important, as we said earlier, is to give a rating for number in number form, give a numbers rating to each ESG factor. And also we mentioned how to talk about transferring the improvements or lack of improvements year on year into a dollar amount. And again, just have to remember that we are persuading people that they can be trusted. That is, we can be trusted, right? Our company, that we are transparent, that we're thorough, that we're accountable, we're working hard. And we want to show them that ESG can help the financial bottom line of profit. So I know this is important, at least in the US space, because social media can either break or enhance or help reputation. And those companies that have ESG reports annually, and if those ESG reports are very transparent, social media will pick it up on its own. You're going to have cable news and New York Times, all of that, but the social media can be a killer or not. And then, there's going to be a section on the certification. You want a independent certification or certification of public accounts. There are public accounts here in the United States that specializes in certifications of ESG reports. Obviously, there are other independent certification bodies as well, because people want to know what was a third party, who else had eyes on what you did. And finally, there's a section on the future ESG plans, and basically it sums up how you've managed the ESG risk in the past 12 months. It shows the ESG practices, how they have increased in the past 12 months. That's how they've become more positive. And then explain plans and goals and financial targets for ESG in the next 12 months. And then, I always say end with an optimistic statement, stating that your ESG practices have contributed positively to the community in your country. Talk about how you've helped the local community, for example, educating young people. I'll give examples how you've helped the country in terms of reducing pollution and things of that nature. And then this is really the conclusion. We don't have to go all into it, but you can contribute by saying, as we began this report, linking our ESG annual practices to the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you can lay out even more detail how your ESG annual report fulfills one of the 17 goals. And then it's an optimistic end there. So why don't I end there so we can have a little more time for conversation. I can also explain some of the things I went over in the presentation. Let's see, how do I share? There we go. Sharing screen. Would we like to just open up for questions, or how do you want to conduct this section?
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. We'll now open the floor for questions. So people can raise their hands to make the process more efficient if they can just raise their hands if they have any questions, and then yeah. So we'll start with this. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. It was a very illuminating lecture, at least for me. And what I would like to know is that at present in India, we have every board of directors has a CSR committee, the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee, which is called CSR. So can we expand this CSR to further become an ESG, or is there any difference between an ESG committee and a CSR committee? I would like to have your opinion about this, please.
Excellent question. And every now and then it comes up because at the beginning of my slides, I didn't mention CSR specifically. And one of the reasons I don't usually use CSR because I know, at least here in the US, people define corporate social responsibility differently. Some define it as impact investing or having impact on communities. Some have defined it as do no harm, that is to don't invest or engage with or partner with companies that they would say alcohol or tobacco or firearms. So I have not used corporate social responsibility as a category. I do think that corporate social responsibility can be defined as ESG because corporate social responsibility is such a fluid term, at least in my experience, both working with partners as well as research. It's a very fluid term. And because it's so fluid and open that it can embrace ESG. So if we want to call it corporate social responsibility on a board and not call it ESG, but as long as the content and the practices are ESG practices, I would, to me, the annual report can say, well, we have we led our whole process for the last 12 months by this corporate social responsibility committee on the board, and then talk about the practices and the content of how that corporate social responsibility committee led it for a year. So.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins.
Sure.
Yeah, Mr. Surya, you can go ahead.
Good morning, Professor Hopkins. Can you hear me? This is Surya G. Digunta.
Very clear.
Yeah, thanks, Professor, for such a fantastic presentation. And I have two questions. One question is ESG investments started paying off? Like, do we have a data where we compare non-ESG investments to ESG investments and see, like, over a period of time, how these both the different investment funds, how they are faring, so that data. And my second question is related to India. Right now, the ESG team has just started. The investments are very minuscule when compared to the total assets under management under mutual funds have. So how can we make the mutual funds join this bandwagon of ESG? Thank you.
Right. Yeah, no, thank you. Another very question. I have another slide presentation on comparing the bottom lines, the revenue and the profits and electronic trade ETFs as well as mutual, the forms of mutual funds, stocks, and overall the ESG oriented investments are doing either the same or better.
Oh, okay.
Better.
So,
yeah, and we can do that. Now it's important to understand why that is. ESG, often people see ESG as something that you do good for the environment or you help poor kids, in the urban areas, which it is, but it's a triple bottom line. And so I often say people, if there's no margin, there's no mission. So it's got to be a triple bottom. ESG is triple bottom line. The way we work with it, help people, help the planet, and help profit. And so what's driving such good results of ESG investments? Now, in the United States, the two major generations now are millennial generations and Generation Z. And there's a huge transfer of wealth It's something like in the next from 20 to 30, I don't know, it's like, 18 trillion or maybe it's 38 trillion. It's a huge number. It's part of my, the data I present for this, this other lecture I do. And so that generation is asking questions about ESG. They're asking questions about ESG in companies they want to work with. They're asking questions about ESG in the products that they want to buy. I give an example. So I teach a course on social entrepreneurship, and then inevitably I have students from all over the university, but I'm always keen about the business school students. They're like 19, 20, 21, maybe 26. And I said, you got a job offer from Goldman Sachs or internship, JP Morgan Chase. Why did you turn it down for this small little place in Silicon Valley or in Ohio? They said, because I prefer the social justice part of the mission of that company. Now, in my generation, you're going to be investment bankers. You're going to go Wall Street. We didn't have Silicon Valley when I was in college. So you're going to go for the money. Yeah. So, but it's a generational shift. It's a generational shift. And they are just very, very keen on everything. And they also, there's a political correctness to the gender. And I'm not saying right or wrong. I'm just talking, if I were a business person or a board of directors, I'm trying to understand, why is this taking off? At least in the US, I can say, and I would also say there's been similar studies in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, which are they're the most keen, they're most advanced on the environmental part of the ESG. Again, there's a demand from the millennials and Generation Z. Also, so the demand is pushing it. And if I have a company, or I have I'm a venture capitalist, or I'm a private equity, or I'm a hedge fund, on the private sector, I'm going to invest in those companies where the demand, the customers are asking about them. So we got customers in demand, we have generational shift, and we also have a push from social media. In the US, social media can make or break a person. It's just incredible. I mean, I've never seen anything from politics to government to, business to educators, professors who've been elevated on ESG, and some have been, broken down. So social media is pushing it. And as you know, well, government regulators are pushing it more and more. They're, from the sort of the big ones like the United Nations, where all the governments, but even individual governments here in the United States, and it's even more being pushed by the U.S. government since beginning of this year. So all types of stakeholders are pushing. And then I guess another part that's pushing is that, at least in the U.S., there's a lot of mass movement, picketing, and just strikes, but they're all pushing for justice, racial justice, women's justice, environmental justice, labor unions. So the so-called masses of people in certain states, it's not all 50 states, but the people who make the most noise are on the social media who are protesting. They get the media. So in the U.S., what that means is if I own a company, I'm gonna shift to where the demand is, and that's what's happening. It's really almost, to me, it's like it's not quite. We'd have to go into my other presentation, but with the data, graphs and data. But it's almost like pure supply and demand. So people think it's some magic. It's people are asking, there's a demand for it, and those corporations are and it's good that the corporations are helping people and the planet. And I think it's going to be here for a while, at least we can see till Gen Z, which comes after millennials.
Yeah, thank you very much for the detailed response, Professor.
Okay, Mr. Vimuri, you can go ahead and ask a question, please.
Good morning, Professor, and good morning, everyone. Being a very new concept and still evolving, how do we ensure that there's a consistency in terms of growth, and what we check and balance to see that different companies are using the same sort of a parameter? The second one is that, is there a closed loop mechanism to see the impact assessment or the impact validation which the of their ESG report?
This is a major question, because you're aware of the concept of greenwashing, right? Which is basically a company that is not practicing ESG, but it claims it is, the so-called greenwashing, which applies both to the E, the social, and the governance ESG. There are a couple of ways to deal with it. One is the independent auditor. And I've seen, depending on the country, people have often used independent auditors to look at their ESG reports. They may use two levels. They may use a local one from the country, right? So someone may use one in India, but then they may go to the US or to Northern Europe to get a second one. Now, this could be troublesome. It could be hindrance, it could be more expensive. But if the local independent certification and the international certification, if they lock together, that Indian company has the potential to not only broaden its customer base revenue domestically, it can increase internationally. So it's a double, it's a double thing. That's one way to do it. The other one too is that there is are you aware of Aspire Impact? Aspire Impact is the only Indian social impact rating company in your country. And it's recognized globally, it's recognized in the United States, it's recognized locally. So you already have one of the leading, you actually are providing a role model for the world. The more and more people hear about Aspire Impact. But Professor Amit Bhatia is the founder and director of it. So you actually have a gold mine right in your own backyard.
Hello. This is Arun here. I've got a question, Professor, on whether the IT companies are implementing the ESG practices, and if so, how does it benefit them?
Right. I mean, one big one is Microsoft. There are others, and obviously in Silicon Valley, and even increasingly, the IT centers in the U.S. are moving outside of Silicon Valley. We just had a conference. Well, before Omicron, everybody was there. So Chicago is becoming a center. Austin, Texas is becoming a center. Boston, the New York-Boston corridor is becoming a center. But obviously the mother of them all is in Silicon Valley. So you have some of the major companies, such as Microsoft and others, who are doing these annual reports. And in broad terms, it's they would argue that it's accelerating their impact with the millennials, is accelerating their impact with Generation Z. And they would say that they're also getting a lot of good media representation, which again is branding, increasing the branding or further improving the branding and the reputation and the trust. This is the issue a lot with social media in the United States. Once there's the trust, it's hard to repair that. And social media can, we talk about facts and false facts and fact checking. All these things are real at various levels, not just in the political realm or cable news, but also the same method of process of social media has a role and impacts how business is done. And so far, there has been any major hits there in terms of that form of IT.
Okay, but are they looking at any social impact, or because environmental impact, they're not making much? IT companies do not have much to play on the environmental impact. It could be at least only the social impact if technology they can do that. So what is your view?
Well, the Gates Foundation, which is an extension of everything he's done, as a whole priority of education, right?
Okay.
That's been a big one. And also since the whole racial unrest last summer, I mean, a lot of people don't know it, but in summer of 2020, some have said there were over 500, demonstrations, which is huge in the United States, in any country. Well, maybe, and then let me skip to the U.S., right?
Yeah.
And so part of the money that Gates and the foundation, he and his wife divorced, but still they have the foundation. They're shifting money towards it's called diversity, equity, and inclusion. Basically, racial and ethnic justice. And that's basically what it is. So again, they are responding to the demand of racial diversity.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Suryavanshi, if you can ask a question. Hello, can you hear us? All right. Mr. Richard, you have to unmute yourself. Okay. Yeah, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Dr. Hopkins, I'm interested in what seems to me to be the beginning point, and that is what are the different ways in which a baseline for ESG performance is set? In other words, company, is it a third party enterprise? What, in your experience, what are the best ways to set the baseline for one's organization in ESG?
Another great question. I mean, I think there are a couple of ways, two or three. One is part of the process of writing, researching, data, and scoring. Those three parts of how do we develop the report, is talking to every stakeholder, every part, every community that are touched by the corporation. And in the process of talking to the people on the ground, we find out which are the most important ESG practices that the company should include in the report. And we find out what are the bad practices, ESG practices of the corporation, right? So part of doing that research, collecting the data, a lot of those issues about baseline and then projections for next year, year on year, will emerge out of that process. So what we try to do is we try to talk about, there's the PRI, there's the SDGs, there's oh my gosh, there's I have a whole nother thing on all the things the United Nations is calling for. They have a investors PRI. It's huge, right? It's about 10 of them. So when I work with, I said, look, don't just impose certain criteria from above the United Nations, but know what's going on, right? And we know what's going on, but let it emerge organically, which eventually will become the baseline. It emerges organically out of the process of talking to everybody. That's one. Two is to look at one's peers. So there's another part of the slide I left out, but it's about being aware of peers. Okay, so if we're talking about technology, who are the competitors, what processes because all the stuff is public. So you look at their reports and try to assess what their baseline is. And oftentimes studying them will also, it depends. It's a competition, but it can increase one's consumer base to see what the competitors, so the peers are going to do it. And then third thing, and this is country by country, is what's the government regulators? What are they asking? What are they asking? There's a big one, which everybody's trying to do now, right? Which is the carbon neutrality. All of that is, everybody's saying that, right? Whether the U.S. government can do it is another. Northern Europe is moving ahead. In fact, England has already mandated it it's a mandate. Here in the United States, it's even the current administration, it's strongly recommended. It's not mandated. It's strongly recommended. But so basically, one, out of the organic process of talking to the receptionists at the front desk, to the supply chain, to the engineers, to customers, to the local communities where the corporation exists and has impact, there will be people who will know every day, these are the issues that impact us. And two, looking at peers, studying peers, and usually a lot of these corporations, they're in the annual meeting, right? They're in the annual meeting. So they see each other. I did a thing with the it's the International International Copper Association. So all the copper people are in this association. They talk to each other, right? And so the third one again is to country by country. What are the government regulators asking for? And a lot of them now is talking about carbon reduction, carbon neutrality, COP6, all of that stuff. So again, those are the three ways we try to get to this baseline. And again, I think it's important to know about what's happening globally, but I always try to suggest that rely on the particularity of one's own company. I'll give it just another example. There was a company here in the U.S. and they're saying, well, we want to talk to you because you guys have an ESG center at the University of Chicago and you've been doing some work with people. And they said, well, so a couple of the C-suite guys were, CEO and actually CTO, CEO, and the marketing guy, I guess maybe CMO, Chief Marketing Officer. And he said, yeah, we signed the Principles of Responsible Investment, PRI, from the United Nations. And how are we going to implement this? And so I said, well, what? So the first question I had to them was, why did you sign the document? So we got into a whole conversation about what were their motivations. And then they began to discover, well, you know what? Actually, that's not a good starting point for us. It's better for us to talk to our local people. And then out of that, use our organically natural self-assessment and then then apply the 6 PRI principles. And so it's just a great, because they felt this pressure that their competitors were, signing the PRI documents, and the competitors were trying to do the 17 SDGs of the United Nations. And it was just a great conversation about just asking the question, why did you sign the document? So, but it is important to know all the international, global, report standards, criteria, all of that stuff is very important. And it's all online. I mean, you could just get a committee to read, or an intern from a business school, they could read all of that stuff.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. If there's any other question, this is. I mean, we still have a couple of minutes. So if someone wants to come in and ask any question, please go ahead. Otherwise, I would request Professor Neeraj Gupta to close the session. Okay. There's one more question.
Hello. I'm audible, sir?
Yes. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir, for your very good presentation, Hopkins, sir. I think the much more importance also needs to be given to improve the profitability of companies to encourage investors. There are some companies which are not performing well, that also to be taken care of while undertaking this. That is also one of the welfare of the investors that is the most important, in my opinion.
Could you give me that again, please?
Pardon, sir?
Could you repeat the question, please? I didn't get the total.
Sir, now until now, the investors should get more profits, so that the company should increase its productivity and profitability to encourage investors. There should not be every company should perform with profits in the surplus. Any step can be taken to encourage to make the companies profitable. So
to encourage investors and also increase profitability.
Yes. If the profits increase, the investors will be given dividends, sir.
Okay. We talked about how we frame ESG as people, planet, and profit.
Yes.
And if a company is engaged in ESG practices for a whole year,
Yes.
and then year on year they've lost profit, then there's a problem with how they're doing the ESG assessment, because usually, as we talked before, that compared to non-ESG practicing companies, the ESG companies are either equal to or surpasses them, and there are always a couple of 1 or 2 laggards. So there's enough data to show, at least in this part of the world, that ESG companies are yield profit, it's not just do good, for people or do good for the planet. It does do that, but it can help the top line and the bottom line, which is the profit.
extension.
And it can, and the other takeaway, particularly for investors, is to explain to them how consumers and the generational shift, again, I'm talking obviously a US context, how the generational shift and the transfer of trillions of dollars to the millennials and Generation Z, and how they're demanding it. And there's a lot of data and evidence to show that there is a transition in generational wealth, and there's more and more demand on the part of these two generations for products, services, and investment. They too are also the investors in our company. They are the ones who are taking a lot of lead on this as well. So those are just some of the sharings from the U.S. context. We could have to do another session on investors' appetite in India.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. This has been very helpful for me.
No, yeah. So I would request Professor Neeraj Gupta to close the session, please.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very
Thank you, Amar. I would like to thank Professor Hopkins for sparing his valuable time, specifically at such a late hour, and also orienting us, because, you know, as you might be aware, I could see your India engagements and specifically engagements on the ESG aspects. Yes, we are evolving on ESG. The regulatory frameworks are gearing up, but I'm sure you must be aware about the BRSR framework, which has recently been made mandatory for top 100 companies by Security Exchange Board of India, and from 1st of April, the companies would be reporting. It would be a great step, and I'm sure as the things will evolve, we all will learn more in terms of the opportunities to integrate, as you specifically handled E, S, and G aspects separately, and in a very nice manner as to how it could be brought to the spotlight of the board for taking various decisions. The reporting frameworks would also strengthen over a period of time, and I'm sure we'll meet out the challenges which again you have highlighted in terms of having traction from the investors, and at the same time addressing to good regulation, good reputation, good consumers, and a wider well-being of all the stakeholders. So would like to thank you for sparing your time once again, and wish you good luck. Hope we will be in connect and we will get opportunities to learn from your expertise. Thank you so much. And participants, thank you for sparing your morning time. I wish you a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.